Hello, good afternoon. I am so excited that you guys are here today. I can remember what it was like a few years ago for me to be sitting where a lot of you are sitting today and wondering, what is the path that God has for me? Where is He taking me? And I really couldn't have dreamed what that would look like for me and the places God would take me and the stories that I'm going to get to share with you today that God allowed me to be a part of. And so the first thing I just want to say is how thrilled I am that many of you here today are considering the question of what God's path and what God's journey is for you and what calling He might have on your life and what that could look like. So we're going to talk about what that journey can be and how God can bring you into this abundant path of joy when we say yes to Him. I want to start by asking you a question, right? This is a medical and missions conference, so most of us here are in some kind of medical field, right? And so I want you to think about this question: why did you choose this career in medicine? Some of you are very early in that path, some of you much further along, but we all have a why, right? It could be your family was all medical, no one in your family was medical, you wanted to try something new. Maybe you just did really well in the sciences in school, maybe you felt called to it from a really young age. But why did you choose to go into medicine? And then the second question I want you to think about as we get started is, has that reason ever failed you? Right? Has there been any point on your journey where it didn't feel like quite enough? Maybe it was a late night studying. You'd been, a little too little sleep as you were going for finals. Maybe a really hard clinical rotation. Maybe it was a bit into your practice and you didn't know what you had quite gotten yourself into. Maybe a patient just yelled at you, or a really difficult coworker or a preceptor. You walk out of clinicals and I just bombed that, right? And you're going, what am I doing here? Healthcare can be a really hard field to be in. And so I want you to keep thinking about these two questions as we move forward. Why did I go into medicine? And has that reason ever not been quite enough? And while you think about that, I'm going to tell you a story about my journey and how I ended up as transitioning from a physician assistant in emergency medicine to working at Samaritan's Purse with this fancy title, Global Health Technical Specialist. I just support several countries in their ongoing health programming and work as a first responder for our disaster relief. So I was really blessed early in my life to go to a church that had a heart for outreach, had a heart for missions. And I remember missionaries coming to speak at our church when I was young. I remember my mom talking about how she wanted to be a missionary when she was a kid. Reading books about the greats, right? Like Adoniram Judson and Hudson Taylor and Amy Carmichael and Lottie Moon. And I think in all of that, I almost developed such a revere for the missionaries that I thought I could never be one. Right? That was this special class of people over here who went and served the Lord and did these really cool things, and I was just normal me. And then you hit middle school and we start to develop a bit more awareness about social norms and people around us. And I remember people would come to my church, and I remember specifically a missionary talking about living in a hut in Africa and getting bit by a monkey and not having running water. And I noticed that other people didn't go, that is the coolest thing I've ever heard. How do I go do it? Right? That's not a normal response. Something in my brain seemed to be wired a little differently, right? Something stirred in my heart that didn't stir in everyone else's. And it's kind of like Jason talked about last night, right? A lot of times there's not this lightning moment. I wish God posted His plan for us on a billboard, but He doesn't, right? A lot of times it's what's the stirring in your heart? What keeps drawing your attention? What's a little different about you and draws out your passion? And I realized that if God kept calling my attention to these things, if I thought living in a hut in Africa and getting bit by a monkey sounded like the coolest thing in the world, that probably meant something. And so I was really quite young when I made this commitment to international missions and to go overseas, but I didn't know exactly what that would look like. And so I went into college. I liked science, so I majored in biology. No idea where I was going with that. And I'm I'll do anthropology. It'll help me understand cultures. And I remember meeting with my advisor my freshman year of college and talking about how I'd probably like to work in South Asia someday. And he told me to take Hindi, and I said, no, I'm never going to India. So naturally, that's where I spent the next summer, of course, because God has quite a sense of humor. And so I spent the summer in India and continued to develop this passion for missions. And then I was studying biology at a pretty prominent pre-med school with a medical school. So the question I got really regularly is, oh, you're pre-med. And I said, no, I'm never going into medicine. And there's God's sense of humor again, right? I had this crazy idea to do an 8-year degree in medical anthropology, and thankfully God led me on a different direction. I found out what a PA was my junior year of college. By God's grace, I got into Baylor College of Medicine here in Houston. If you're a student studying here in the Texas Medical Center, man, what an opportunity. Take advantage of that. It's incredible. And so I got to go to Baylor and then moved back to St. Louis, where I got a job as a PA in emergency medicine, working in a level 1 trauma center. I kept working towards this path of knowing I wanted to go into missions, but we have to get experience. You have to pay off all that student debt. I also went to the certificate program that InMed offers for a diploma in international medicine and public health. Their booth is out here. Strongly recommend go say hello if you want to expand some of your knowledge. And I kept working on gaining some skills, but about 5 to 6 years into that job at the emergency department, pretty quickly I found myself feeling all of these symptoms of what we would call burnout, right? I hated going to work every day, dreaded it. I didn't like who I was with my colleagues and my patients a lot of the times. I wasn't happy with my career growth. And I would go on mission trips. I'd have to fight my boss every time to get the time off work, even though I had the vacation hours. And so I was on a mission trip around 2016 in India, and I found the Holy Spirit whispering this question to my heart. Why do you spend 11 years of the month going to a job you hate and 2 weeks of the year doing something that you love, that you're passionate about, that brings out the best in you and gives you the sense of purpose and fulfillment? And so I went home and I spent about 3 months praying, and then I stepped out of my comfort zone and I did something that was a little scary as a single person with no backup income. I quit my job. And God was really gracious to me that year after I did that. But going back to that question I asked, why did you choose a career in medicine? When you think about that, we all have a certain calling as Christians, right? And we all have an individual path that God has called us on, but we have a shared calling. And I would call that a call to communion. We have this call that Christ gave us right before he went to the cross. He gave a command. He said, to drink this cup with me, to do this in remembrance of me. And when we think about what was the cup that Christ was drinking, he was drinking the cup of his suffering, right? He was drinking the cup of his own blood, the cup of leaving the comfort of his home in heaven and coming to a place where I needed to be rescued and you needed to be rescued and the whole world needed to be rescued. And that's the cup that he was drinking. And when God called us to drink this cup with him, I think it was more than a call to perform a religious ceremony sitting in a church pew. We should do that, right? We have to remember Christ's sacrifice, but there's more to it than that. He's calling us to join him in this path of suffering on behalf of others. I love this quote from Hudson Taylor, God's work done God's way will not lack God's supply. As I mentioned, that first year after I quit my job, God was really gracious. He gave me a great PRN job. I worked less, earned more, started going on more mission trips. He was also really faithful in the next years when my income went way down and I learned to live on a lot less. And he was faithful in his timing. I found out about Samaritan's Purse disaster assistance response team at a time when my dad was sick and needing full-time care for my mom. She needed a lot of support. I applied as soon as I found out because I knew that was what I wanted to be doing, but I didn't get the call to join the team until just a few months before my dad passed because God knew I needed to be at home during that time. And around the time my dad passed, something was happening in the world. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, an Ebola outbreak was ramping up. And so I joined the team just a few months before that happened, and then about a month after my dad passed, and I was freed up in a new season of life to go. I got the call to go to Ebola training. And while I was at that Ebola training, I want to share with you guys, let's watch this video of what was happening in the Congo.
Ebola is a terrible disease that kills over 50% of the people that it touches.
Ma sœur est morte d'Ebola. Elle est mariée avec trois enfants.
Currently here in the Democratic Republic of Congo, this is the world's second most deadly outbreak of all time. I'm proud that we're coming back to clinically combat Ebola, and the international community has been very thankful. So we're opening up an Ebola Treatment Center.
We'll phase up pretty quickly, close to a 60-bed unit.
So we have a minimum rotation of 3 weeks, but many people stay for much longer than that.
I have an incredible team of nurses and doctors and healthcare professionals. They're ready for the fight. Everyone's here to do what God has called them to do.
Please pray for the Samaritan's Purse staff. Please pray for all the people that are suffering from this deadly virus.
So in March of 2019, I arrived at the Ebola Treatment Center that you just saw there in DRC, and I was taking care of patients now in what should have been the hardest conditions that I had ever done that in, right? In a way that there's like literal physical barriers between you and your patients. It's in the heat of the jungle, you're wearing all that gear you saw, this full Tyvek suit, sweating about 1 liter an hour. There's like all of this gear, hood, mask, gloves, barriers between you and your patients. And yet, for the first time in my career as a PA, I thought practicing medicine felt like it always was supposed to, right? All of the barriers that we have here in our American healthcare system that we would call opportunities and resource, I think they often put something between us and our patients, right? We're so reliant on the system and the other people and the other specialists, and all of a sudden, it was just me and my patient, right? And I was gonna do everything I could for them to save their lives in a condition that they probably shouldn't live. And it was incredible. I'll never forget Mulasi, one of our patients that came in. She came as what we call a suspect patient, and that means that she had the symptoms of Ebola and she needed to be isolated while she was tested. So we put her in our suspect ward. She'd also been diagnosed with HIV just a few days prior, which is met with great stigma in the Congo, and she knew, she was a sex worker. She knew she would never be able to go back to work, never go back to her community. She had nothing left. So the first time I went in to assess her, she was laying there in her own vomit and diarrhea, and the nurses told me she had refused Tylenol for her fever, she had refused an IV, and she would refuse to even let them clean her up because she was completely despairing. She just wanted to die. She didn't want us to do anything for her. And I think we've all faced or will face those moments in our medical career when we realize that all the medical training in the world, all the technical expertise has nothing to offer our patient because they need something more. And God was really gracious that day. He gave me a clear message to speak to her because my translator's name was Emmanuel. And I knew that the message she needed to know is that there's a God that came to be with us. And I spoke to her about that. And as we each went in and cared for her, she began to receive our care. And on the third day, the same day that she tested negative for Ebola, one of the nurses got the privilege of leading her to Christ. The woman that came in despairing for her life left with a smile of joy on her face. Yeah, it's worth clapping for. She left beaming, in fact, and she died 3 days later in the local hospital. But I know that one day I'll see her again in heaven. And I got to be a part of her story, right? It was God who did the work, but I had the privilege of witnessing it. But I had to get up close and personal with her and her suffering for that to happen. I couldn't sit in the comfort of my own home, right? It's hard for me to tell you this story to this day without crying because I still bear just a little piece of the pain that she had in my heart. We have to step into the suffering of others if we're going to witness the miracle of what God wants to do in their lives. Philippians 3:10 reminds us of this longing that we're supposed to have, that I may know him and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death. 2 Corinthians 5 reminds us that we're Christ's ambassadors, that God's making an appeal through us. We beg you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. You see, as healthcare professionals, we have this incredible, unique opportunity to step into this call to communion with Christ in a way that not everyone can. During Jesus' earthly ministry, he consistently did two things. He preached and he healed. And we get to follow that command in 1 John to walk as Jesus walked and do that if we're willing to join him in his suffering. Have you ever asked yourself this question? Where's God in the suffering? Or maybe the question that you ask yourself is, if I say yes, to what God is calling me to go to the hard places, to go to the vulnerable people of this world. What am I going to do with all of that? I had someone ask me that recently. I was teaching a training for our DART team for Samaritan's Purse, and they said, we're going to go see all these hard things. What do you do with that? And actually, God brought to mind 3 lessons he taught me over the last years, and that's what I'm sharing with you today. But this is a very real question that we have when we see all this. It's actually our natural instinct, right, that we want to avoid suffering and sorrow. We fear it. And a lot of us, if we grew up in the first world, we almost find it shocking and surprising when we face it. And yet the Bible tells us that we're blessed when we mourn. The Bible tells us not to shy away from the hard things and from the suffering. The founder of Samaritan's Purse, right, people now associate it with Franklin Graham, but it was actually Bob Pierce. And Bob Pierce is really well known for praying this prayer, let my heart be broken for the things that break the heart of God. So as I continued to deploy with Samaritan's Purse, I started praying this prayer. I went back to DRC a few times, and then something kind of unimagined had happened. Samaritan's Purse had never deployed a medical response to the US, and this thing you may have heard of called COVID-19, it came, and it hit New York with a force. And every hospital was completely overwhelmed. Every ICU spot had 2 patients in it. Every ICU had been turned into a COVID ICU. And something that we could have never imagined or thought of, the city asked Samaritan's Purse to come start a field hospital. And so, again, God's supply, because our team has developed this incredible modular system of tiers of field hospitals. Even though we had never done this before, we were able to put this respiratory care unit right there in Central Park, 68 beds, an ICU, a step-down unit, and 3 wards. Because we were prepared to do Ebola again when no one else had PPE, we had it stocked on our shelves abundantly, right? God was so good. That was the hardest 6 weeks of my life. We didn't know what we were doing. Patients were dying, healthcare workers were dying. I think back to going into our step-down unit. The ICU patients are asleep, it's kind of calm, but the step-down unit was just 14 people struggling for breath, wondering if they were going to be the next ones to get intubated and die. I remember walking down the street the day we had closed down the field hospital. I was flying out that afternoon, and I was actually walking down 5th Avenue to go get my last cup of New York coffee before I left. And I was waiting to cross the street, and I just found myself weeping. And it took me by surprise because I should have been relieved. I was finally going home. I'd been pretty anxious to do that, maybe get a good night's sleep. And I was done with this thing that had been so hard. And you think, okay, maybe it's just pent up emotion, but God spoke to my heart so clearly in that moment. And he told me, Shannon, what you're feeling right now is the smallest piece of what I feel for this city as I look over it. And I weep for the people whose hearts are so hard to me. The answer to the question of where is God in the suffering is in the fact that we're even asking that question. I can't look at people's suffering and summon up compassion in my own heart or the ability to care and wonder why that's happening, except that it comes from the heart of God. The answer to that question is the fact that you're there, the fact that he sends us into the suffering with them. I think of those 6 weeks that our tents were there in Central Park, and you look over New York. I love the pictures of nighttime. You see all the lights of New York City, and then there's this spot of darkness that's Central Park, and right in the middle of it are our white tents just shining brightly, right? They were a literal beacon of hope in the darkness, the snow white lights of our tents with the cross emblazoned on that. I remember getting an email from some of the nurses, case managers at our partner hospital, and what they said was, we feel like the staff of Samaritan's Purse laid down their life in the place of ours because they were going to go have to take care of those patients if we hadn't. And at that time, healthcare workers were dying quite a bit. Is there any clearer picture of the gospel than for someone to feel that you laid down your life in the place of theirs? But that would have never happened if there hadn't been this time of tragedy, right? New York was not going to open their doors to Samaritan's Purse to tear up a historical field in Central Park without something difficult going on. And as we think of this, I realized something as I processed all this. God is not afraid to grieve with us if that means that we won't have to grieve without him for eternity. Let me say that again. God is not afraid to grieve with us to ensure that we will not have to grieve without him for eternity. He knows that often our hearts are very hard to him, and when things are going well, we don't look for our need. And I fully believe that when our hearts break, his breaks even more. I think of John 11, where Lazarus had just died, and Jesus told the disciples, "I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there so that you may believe, but let us go to him." And then he arrives, right? And he sees Mary and Martha weeping. He sees the Jews that came with her also weeping. He's deeply moved in spirit and troubled. They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus wept, knowing that he was about to heal Lazarus, knowing that he was about to take their pain, and yet he wept with them. Right? God is with us in our weeping. He's with us in our sorrow. Genesis 6 talks about, right before the flood, how it broke God's heart. Psalms 56 reminds us that God takes our tears so seriously that he collects them, that he holds them in a bottle. And so when we look at going out to the suffering in the world, we can't try to summon up this compassion on our own. Our bucket will run dry. But we can let God fill our hearts with his sorrow, with his compassion, go out, weep for the world on his behalf, and then we get to give those tears back to a God who holds them for us. I have a favorite song by a group called Porter's Gate. It's based on the quote, "Do small things with great love." And the verse says, "In the kingdom of the heavens, no suffering is unknown. Each tear that falls is holy, each breaking heart a throne. There is a song of beauty on every weeping eye, for there is one who loves me. His heart it breaks with mine." Let's move on from all that sorrow. What was the happiest time in your life? Think about that and why you think it was. God has promised us an abundant life of joy, but I think we question if it could truly be through sowing sorrow and tears that joy will come. One of my favorite books is 1,000 Gifts by Ann Voskamp, and she talks in here about the mysterious nature of the economy of God. She says it's the fundamental, lavish, radical nature of the upside-down economy of God, empty to fill. While the deceiver jockeys to dupe us into thinking otherwise, we who are made in the image of God, formed in Christ's likeness, our happiness comes too, not in the having, but in the handing over. Give your life away in exchange for many lives. Give away your blessing to multiply blessing. Give away so that many might increase, and do it all for the love of God. In 2021, an earthquake, 7.2 magnitude, hit southern Haiti. About 24 hours after that, I was with a team at Greensboro at our hangar where we got on the Samaritan's Purse plane and flew down there. When we did our assessment, you can see some of the devastation that happened there. And we saw that the hospitals were significantly damaged. Every operating theater in the city was not functioning, and now they had all this trauma to deal with. Patients were lined on the streets and the sidewalks because they were afraid to go inside the damaged buildings. And so we set up what's called a Tier 1 surgical hospital. That's our most austere model of field hospital that can be taken into very remote and difficult to access locations. In the next 5 weeks, we saw thousands of patients, did about 125 orthopedic surgeries and skin grafts. When I left, I remember flying out in the Samaritan's Purse plane, and we flew over the site where our hospital had been. And I remember looking out over that field and realizing that I had just spent 5 weeks in this sauna that they've titled Haiti. It's like the hottest place imaginable, living in a tent, sleeping in a cot, using a porta potty, right? Seeing really hard things that our patients were going through, and having a surprising realization that it was probably the happiest time of my life. James 2 reminds us to consider it pure joy, brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. 63% of physicians are burnt out in recent studies, and I'm sure that applies to other medical fields too. The world tells us all these things about self-care. It becomes this to-do list, right? If I do, all just the right things, I'll find fulfillment in my career. I'll escape the burnout and the compassion fatigue. And yet when we go to the Bible with this question of how do we find resilience, how do we find ourselves mature and complete and not lacking anything, what's the path to joy? It tells us that the way to joy is through sorrow and trial. It tells us that the path to endurance is through hardship. I just got back from a field hospital in Sudan, and here's some pictures from that. And when you look at all these pictures, I don't know what theme you notice. There's a few different things that are similar throughout the pictures, but what I notice is the smiles of joy on every face. There was so much hardship and suffering. The largest humanitarian crisis in the world is happening in Sudan right now, and yet look at the joy. And that's what I remember when I think of being there. I think of the women and the children who found safety and love and dignity and compassion. The path to joy and resilience might just surprise us by being the hardest path we can take. It's not necessarily in ease or comfort or self-care that we're going to find joy. It's often in sorrow and trial. God weeps for a world that is so far from him. His heart breaks with pain, and he's called us to be the bearer of his care, sowing with tears that we might reap a harvest of joy for eternity with those we reach. And so my challenge to you today is, will you ask God to break your heart for the things that break his? Will you put your yes on the altar to wherever God is calling you? That could be here at home in the US, that could be in a distant corner of the world. Will you just go visit the booth of the organization that has caught your attention? The final verse of that song I mentioned says, "At the table of our Savior, no mouth will go unfed. His children in the shadows stream in and raise their heads. Oh, give us ears to hear them and give us eyes that see. For there is one who loves them. I am his hands and feet."